the real problem, right, is not the problem is not necessarily the oil itself, but its lack of investment or lack of the idea of diversifying or making practical steps or doing the hard work of industrializing. Because it's easy to write policy documents, come up with plans, rolling plans, so easy. But industrialization, and by industrialization in this context, I'm looking at refining, I'm looking at processing of agri exports and all of this. It's hard work. It's not just about making announcements and then you go to sleep as the government, right? You need to do the work.
No, but that's what it seems like they're doing. Because I found out yesterday there's 4 refineries that we actually have or tried. At one point they tried to get going, but apparently no one maintained the refineries.
That's the hard work.
They went to shit.
And that's the hard work, right?
The Inspire Us podcast.
Do you have a good balance though? Or do you think the PhD is so overwhelming, you just are focusing on it?
Yeah, so my process was a bit skewed. In my first year was really packed. Like, so I did a lot of work. Most of I'd say 80% of, no, that's too much. Maybe 60-70% of my entire thesis is what was done in my first year.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I was living in London, moved here from Nigeria, living here, but I didn't know anywhere.
Wow.
I was just stuck to my work, library, home, laptop. And at some point, my wife was like, "Are you married to me, or are you married to your
thesis?"
Married to the game.
Yeah, so you just had to. I just knew that. Look, this is my first year was intense. Then my second year was a bit laid back, and then I took a break after I passed my what do you call that thing? In your first year, at the end of the first year, you defend your work to a panel, and then they decide whether you progress to the next year. So when I passed that, I got relaxed, and then I was now living in London, speaking at Chatham House, having interviews at BBC, Al Jazeera. I was out there. Like, I was going to conferences, speaking at so many places, talking about Africa, Nigeria, and all of that. So that's how my work was structured. Then in my third year, I go back to it again full time.
So were all those interviews a product of you passing your first year of your PhD?
Not really.
Oh, you would have just...
It was basically because of my role as a senior economist at the NESG, at the Nigerian Economic Summit Group. And, you built a profile to the extent that people can call you and say, oh, the central bank has just increased interest rates in Nigeria. What does it mean for the country?
Okay.
And then you're speaking about it, 5-10 minutes discussions. And then I've had media interviews back in Nigeria all the while, different interview stations. So it was easy for me to continue that whilst, living here. And then also I do a lot of writings, posting on LinkedIn, write about mostly growth, development, inflation, and all of that. So when I post, most times journalists get to pick that, make a story out of it, and have interviews. Yeah, so I get invited. Even whilst I was here, many people didn't know I was here. They thought I was in Nigeria because you see me on Nigerian TV stations talking about an issue, and they're like, I thought this guy is abroad. I thought he's in the UK, but then I follow Nigerian news. I'm up to date. Still associated with my company. I do research and all that. So it was easy for me to move on that line. Follow the news. Trump, what's happening? How is it going to affect?
Every day there's news now.
Yeah. Do you see the list of the tariff? He just
Yeah.
Well, I've only seen the UK. I've been quite detached from it all.
Yeah,
recently,
the UK is just 10%, so he's increased tariffs from China.
Did Nigeria get tariffs?
Yeah, 14%.
Wow.
What was it? Sorry,
14.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Nigeria got away lightly.
Yeah.
But
South
what did you
Africa,
think?
30%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because he pulled out this big board and China,
exactly. And then China,
loves
34%.
the performance.
It's just absurd. Like,
But I was wondering, because he said, this is retaliation, but he calls it kind retaliation. He says he's looking at the tariffs that they're putting on America, and he's putting half. And he was saying tariffs and also adjusted currency. And I was thinking, how do we check this? Because they're saying 67% China,
yeah.
but who's checking these figures?
So what they did, or what he did, was he looked at the deficit between the U.S. and China, right? The trade deficit between the U.S. and China, and picked the deficit, trade deficit between U.S. what U.S. exports and imports from China. He picked the deficit and divided it by U.S. imports from China. So it's almost like the trade gap between U.S. and China is what he used to define the tariffs. And then when he did that, he got 67%, and then he divided it by 2, so 34% or thereabout. That's what was allocated to China, which is a very, I don't know if I can say this, ridiculous way of implementing tariffs. Like, how do you, and first of all, on the other side where you saw he said China's tariff on U.S. goods is somewhere around 6-7%. And then he said something about currency manipulation. So subjective. Like, there is no real way of measuring this in terms of how does this really work. And mind you, what happens to a country where you have a trade surplus with? They still also got a tariff. The UK, 10%.
And the UK didn't get half. They got the same amount, 10%.
10%, the baseline 10%. And then so the real problem is, I don't know the thinking behind some of this. And you can never, there's no country in the world that you can't have trade surplus with all your trade partners. It's not possible. You would certainly have cases where you export more, you import more from different countries. It doesn't have to be, I want surplus, and then you do the math, and then you calculate, if I raise tariff, I'm going to get XYZ billion dollars to fund deficit. Is that all?
Yeah.
It's just a lot of things are missing. I think that rigorous thinking is missing in all of this process.
Yeah, he loves the the headlines.
Exactly.
You saw how happy he was to just be smiling with that board.
Yeah, and then there's some phrases he uses. Is it make America wealthy again, make America rich again? I just don't know. Like, so I think it just means we're in an era where, look, uncertainty is
sky high.
Like, sky high. So if you run a business, you're a government, you're just thinking, what do I do with all of this, right?
Because you can't really, there's no long-term strategy when you don't know what.
No. And in fact, one of the things he's looking out for, and one of the primary objective of all of this is, and he said it many times, he wants to bring in investors into the US. He wants those countries to come back to invest, in the country. But the thing is, people don't just make investment decisions like that. I mean, how would you imagine shutting down a whole factory?
Plant in Asia.
You want to move to the US, and then Trump is there for 4 years. What happens when he's gone? Like, so people, I think the options are like, companies are like, do we just live on with this tariff and pass on the cost to consumers? Or, I mean, how easy is it? Are we going to relocate to our plants to the US? It's not an easy business decision, right? So I think many people are just super worried. The market is showing that today. All
stocks are tumbling
red.
Yeah.
You're just wondering,
where is this going?
Where is this going? Yeah.
Aren't one of the issues that you need more of a concerted effort to sort of bring industry back?
Yeah.
It isn't just going to come from tariffs. There hasn't been a lot of talk about what is he going to do on the ground to sort of facilitate that. Yeah.
And on that, I think, in fact, many African countries also did something similar where you focus more on the trade policy itself. But then there are a lot of other things that you need to do, the homework of making your business environment competitive, issues relating to infrastructure, skills. You want to invest, you want people to bring investment. Where's the labor force? I don't know if you remember was it the Apple CEO, one of the former CEOs, he said when they were deciding on some of their production and they were looking for engineers, right? In the US, they could only get like certain type of engineers to fill a room like this. But in China, they got like a football field, lots of engineers, to be able to to do the work. And so you can imagine the skills requirement that it would take for someone to move a plant, from a country like China or somewhere in East Asia to the US. So all of those groundwork, right, has to be in place, or there has to be preparations for that to happen.
But
So
that's
it's not just
surprising,
tariff.
though,
Yeah.
that a country like America wouldn't have those engineers, and China has. And I wonder if everyone talks about there's a downfall to the West, a downfall of America. Is maybe a drastic move like these tariffs is what is needed to bring back those engineers? Maybe it's to say, hey, we need to figure out a way that maybe Trump is thinking to bring back, manufacturing here. We need to have skilled labor here. And this is his way of saying, hey, we're making a drastic turn now, and everything else will follow. Because if they keep going down the path they've been going, maybe they're going to have less and less engineers, and it's just going to go downhill. So maybe this is his way of bringing things back.
Well, I think he has to do the work. He doesn't, to be honest, it's not just about tariff, right? So he has to really do the work there, if that's it. So I think the point here is, he said that his favorite word in dictionary is tariff, right? And so it has to go beyond that to do the groundwork of investing in areas like skills development, infrastructure, and in fact preparing even more for the impact of this tariff, because what you find most times is when the consumers that would often bear the brunt of all of this. I mean, sometimes in some cases, even the producers, the farmers. Remember in 2018, some of the soybeans farmers in the US had to deal with the negative impact of same Trump's tariff as well, and the retaliation from China. And so if there are no concerted efforts, beyond just tariff itself, I don't think that's enough to attract the kind of investments that he needs or create the kind of impact that he needs, that he wants to see. Yeah. So you have to, for instance, inflation numbers will start going up as a result of this tariff. I mean, it's certain in the US. It's almost inevitable, and not just in the US, everywhere else. So global inflation likely to go up, and that also has implication. Central banks across the world have been trying to reduce interest rates, right, to bring them down, given the impact of the war in Ukraine and all of that. But with this uncertainty that's happening now, most of them would almost like hold rates, or the next step could even be raising rates to control inflation. And of course, that has impact on your mortgage, credit card, and all of those other things. So I struggle to see the positive impact, at least for now. Maybe in the long term, who knows? But all of those things needs to be put in place. It's not just tariff.
And the global south, because we can say this will be detrimental for the US, but I mean, some of these global south countries, a lot of their exports are to the US, and their markets are going to be like severely impacted because they can't access such a large market. I think places like Cambodia, Vietnam, or South Korea even, which are a bit more, a lot more developed, but they really rely on having access to that market. Well, they still have access, but it's not as lucrative as it once was. So how do you see this playing out with a lot of these countries who are very reliant on exporting to the US?
Well, I think because the tariffs are not, it's not uniform across countries, so the rates are different. So in some cases, you could find where you could find a case where countries are almost like competing in a way to still grab a share of the US market, because we're talking about the $27 trillion economy, the largest consumer market in the world, and consumer of so many goods, cars, electronics, pharmaceuticals, and co. So I think the US is still an important market, but for the global south, so imagine you're hit with a tariff of, say 25%, and your neighboring country is 10%. There is that likelihood that, there could be more investment in countries with lower tariffs, relatively lower tariff, and then they would seek to export more to the US. So because importing from a country with 25% tariff obviously makes goods more expensive. So if there are alternatives, and we saw that even playing out in the last episode where he also raised tariff. This time it was the US and China. And then we saw some of those investments moving to some of these countries, Vietnam, South Korea and the likes. And in fact, their export to the US increased as a result of that. So you could see that mild competition playing out this time because, again, it's not uniform, even though there's the baseline tariff of 10%. But there's still some additional tariff. Like China, for instance, got 34% tariff, other countries as well. So because it's not even, what I see playing out is countries trying to take advantage of that and still export more to the US. So, yeah, but still, constricted trade environment. I think that's the message in the next perhaps 1 year or two.
How should Nigeria feel? Or do you think Nigeria has a lot bigger problems at home?
Well, for Nigeria and the US, it's beyond even trade. If you remember, what's it called, the USAID stopping of USAID. In fact, that was even much of a bigger conversation, when Trump came on board. And there's so many programs that are being funded by the US, by USAID in the country. So many programs in the health sector, education sector, and all that. In fact, when he came on, as those programs stopped, in fact, we had cases where people said, they couldn't get funding, they couldn't go to work because some of this funding had stopped. Yeah. So because some of this funding has stopped from the US. Programs to control, diseases and all of that, were halted immediately. So I think that was even much of a bigger concern. I'm not sure Nigerians were expecting or the tariff, and then we got our share of 14%, But in the real sense, I think our trade with the US is still around maybe somewhere between $7 to $8 billion, which, still not so much in terms of our entire trade. I think it's around 10% of Nigeria's total trade volumes. So 10% is quite huge, and we could also see, the fact that of course there will be retaliations from countries, but I don't know if Nigeria can or would want to go that path of retaliating. For a mark with struggling with a country or battling with a country like the US, it's a sad one. And the impact will be felt across sectors, especially those in the agricultural sector that export their goods to the US. I mean, they would have to pass on that cost to the importer, to the consumers. So importers in the US would pass on that cost to the consumers. Or if demand starts to drop, then it means you have to look elsewhere. And there's even much of a bigger issue with the AGOA, which is the African Growth and Opportunities Act. It's almost like a duty-free, quota-free access to the US market. And interestingly, it ends in 2025. So it covers many African countries, right? And so with Trump coming on board, I think there's going to be like a stricter renegotiation of the AGOA, provisions itself, which means that many African countries may not have easy access to the US market, at least in the next 3 to 4 years.
Yeah. I was actually having a conversation with, do you know Murray Last? He's this anthropologist at UCL. And he was just saying that the West, mainly the US and the UK, they're increasingly just becoming quite disillusioned with Nigeria and sort of giving up with Nigeria. There's a lot less interest in Nigeria now than there was perhaps 15, 20 years ago. And he's just saying how his main concern was, because he's a very fervent believer in Nigeria, let's say, because he sees the potential and he's been there for years, and it really disappoints him that there is this increasing neglect from the US and the UK. And he was just saying that he doesn't know how Nigeria is going to deal with this. You know, as the UK and US continue to lose interest, like where is this sort of how they're going to be galvanized or supported in the upcoming years, especially as the economic situation seems to get worse and the politics and whatnot.
Well, I think it's not just a Nigeria thing. I think it's more, it's even broader than Nigeria, and it's even beyond Africa. I think the way the world is going has been trending in the last few years. I think countries are now increasingly looking inwards, you know, and you see that with Trump and all of his policies, right? There's this, you know, attention on looking at, you know, looking at what's going on within your country than this idea of globalization. So in a way, I think it's globalization is constricting, if that's even a better word to use. And so countries in Africa and even in the developing world is something that they will have to deal with, you know, over time. I remember in some 10 years ago or so, about 2013, 2014, when, in fact, the US came up with a strategy that they would start, you know, producing much of the crude oil and reduce importation of crude oil from Nigeria and other African countries and become perhaps self-reliant in crude oil production. And within 10 years, it happened, right? They become the largest oil producing country in the world, you know, at some point struggling with Saudi Arabia up and down. And what that meant for Nigerian crude was that Nigeria had to look for buyers elsewhere, right? You know, move to Asia, move to other countries, other European countries. So we saw that and we went through that phase. So I think it's more about the fact that maybe people are seeing that, or these countries are seeing that, look, globalization has a downfall, you know. It doesn't come with all the good things that we used to enjoy. So now it feels like we've done too much for the rest of the world and we need to put ourselves first. And you also see that with issues relating to immigration. You know, countries are putting themselves first and saying, look, how can I make my own people much better, you know, and then care less about what's happening elsewhere. In a way, I think it just tells you that, look, as a country, especially from the policy angle, I mean, we need to even be more prepared for things like this, especially in the next 3 to 4 years, right? You don't have friends as you used to have, you know, so you need to be very prepared in the sense that, you know, how do you strengthen governance within your country? How do you ensure that whatever money you get, you know, you use them judiciously? How do you ensure that you even strengthen negotiations, bilateral negotiations with countries? And you must have something to offer, which is something I've always argued in Nigeria, that, look, you have to produce more and you have to look beyond oil. Not necessarily, oil is still important, crude oil is still important, but you have to produce other things. You have to diversify your production and offer things to the world, right? It'll get to a point where, look, you'll become so important that you can't be ignored. And I think that's where a country like Nigeria how it needs to position itself. And just look at the immense potential that Nigeria has, whether it's in agriculture, minerals, whether it's in industry, human capital. Like, it's huge. Like, not just Nigeria. I get sometimes worried when I see 44 African presidents, or even more than 54 African presidents, going to the US to see the president, or the Chinese-US, the China-Africa conference, and you have a list of African presidents there to see the Chinese president. I'm just wondering, like, you guys need to, you should know what you have and know that the world needs you.
But I guess it's so boring to talk about Africa's potential or Nigeria's potential. This is a conversation that's been happening for so long. It's abundantly clear how much potential was in that continent. But just to focus on Nigeria and oil.
Yeah.
Why haven't we diversified away from oil? It's
a
the
big
million-dollar question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that would take you back to the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. In fact, just to add context to your question, in the 70s, oil accounted for about 95%, 96% of Nigeria's exports. Fast forward to 2024, which is just last year, oil and perhaps oil-related products, still oil mainly, accounted for 89% of Nigeria's exports. So it tells you that in about 50 years, we've just been mainly exporting one product. But even if you move then to Ghana, it's the same thing with cocoa and gold. And then they added oil. They found oil and added it to the basket. Then 3 of those commodities accounted for 81% of Ghana's export earnings in 2023. And then same thing with many other African countries. So I think the real problem, right, is not the problem is not necessarily the oil itself, but its lack of investment or lack of the idea of diversifying or making practical steps or doing the hard work of industrializing. Because it's easy to write policy documents, come up with plans, rolling plans, so easy. But industrialization, and by industrialization in this context, I'm looking at refining, I'm looking at processing of agri exports and all of this. It's hard work. It's not just about making announcements and then you go to sleep as a government, right? You need to do the work.
No, but that's what it seems like they're doing. Because I found out yesterday there's 4 refineries that we actually have or tried. At one point they tried to get going, but apparently no one maintained the refineries.
That's
and
the hard work.
They went to shit.
And that's the hard work, right?
Or even Dangote, when he wanted to build his refinery, I think energy was a big issue. Infrastructure wasn't there. He had to outsource so many things because the ability to build and do things in Nigeria is just it's extremely limited.
And I heard he even got a lot of trouble from the government.
Yeah.
With a lot of bureaucracy to build this.
Yeah. So he's I would say somebody that he's probably going against the wind. Even though he's also been in a way favored by so many government policies. Not just him, the company, the cement industry, for instance.
So he's been favored by government.
Yeah,
government
I mean, there was what we call the backward integration policy that was brought up in the early 2000s, right? The policy was to support cement production in Nigeria, moving Nigeria from an importer of cement to a net exporter of cement. And in fact, Dangote, Lafarge, and some of the other companies played a big role in that space. Many of these companies benefited from that policy. So there were quotas given to companies that were importing cement that, okay, over time, you would have to start investing, setting up plants. Rather than importing, you would start producing locally. And so with government incentives, support, they were able to set up these plants, including Dangote Cement. So they put that together, invested heavily in the industry. And then, so now Nigeria is a net exporter of cement. So you could say that, he benefited from, stable government policies, and which is what we need. So it's been hard to replicate that success. I would call it success, but because again, there's still a challenge with the price of cement. And in fact, one of the things people argue is that, when you implement import substitution policies and protect an industry, right? When that industry grows and becomes, competitive, the next step should be how do you then reduce that
Support.
all of those blockage that you've put to be sure that the industry can compete with exports or exported goods, right? So perhaps maybe that's the reason why prices are still quite high, because some of those protections are still there. And again, for you to open up for exports, one of the things we've found out in some of my research is that you also need to do the groundwork of issues like infrastructure, energy, cost and all of those other doing business cost in Nigeria. You have to make sure you tackle those issues. Otherwise, there's no way many of our industries will not be competitive with goods coming from say China or South Korea and the likes. So that's the hard work, I'm referring to, that all of these has to be put in place. And to your point on the Dangote refinery, it's just so sad that what he's going through, right? His company should not be going through that, right? They've invested so much in building the world's largest single train refinery, in Lagos, right now as we speak. But there's still some issues going on with people, particularly with those importing petrol, right? So they want to continue importing petrol. And then he has the refinery that can produce what Nigeria needs. So there's this conflict of, clashes of interest as to, who will feed the market.
But you said he's going against the wind. Why is it that Nigeria's wind is staying exactly how it is?
Well, what I think when I say going against the wind, I mean, for instance, with this refinery that he's built, right? One would have thought that he will be given all the support that he needs, just like it was done in the cement industry. And it was not just Dangote, it was other companies benefited from, the cement backward integration policy, right? And in fact, Nigeria now exports cement, a net exporter. So cement has been removed from, the import list. That's a huge savings in terms of foreign exchange, But for this refinery, right? So the government came up with a policy that says Naira for crude. So you sell crude. Crude is produced in Naira in Nigeria, sold in dollars, outside Nigeria. But because of the exchange rate risk, the president announced that crude will be sold to Dangote in Naira rather than in dollars. Because if you price it in dollars, it becomes more expensive because the currency is weaker, has depreciated over time. And then it makes the refined product, which is petrol and other products, more expensive because you purchased your crude in dollars. Businesses, you have to recover your cost. Now the president says, okay, because of that, we'll sell crude to you in Naira, just so you can at least produce and sell at a much lower price. Just recently, that was stopped. So in fact, the prices of petrol started going up again. So it tells you, sometimes you just wonder, like, the interests that are at play here, the people who just want to keep importing this product just so they can make profit out of it, regardless of whether Nigeria produce petrol and refined product. So those are the interests, and that's where the hard work, or part of the hard work that I mentioned, it has to be done. Otherwise, so if I were the president, I would give Dangote Refinery all of the support it needs, because Nigeria has no business should not be importing petrol when you have a refinery like that working, and the government refineries don't necessarily, work as they should.
So who are the people he's sort of fighting against?
Well, to be honest, I don't know them. Yeah, I mean, perhaps maybe the people importing fuel. I mean, those are the people that come to mind, to be honest. And I don't think there should be an excuse on this. I just think from the top at the presidency level, there has to be some deliberate need to support local businesses and to make sure that you see them succeed and thrive. And I think that has to be the idea behind government policies, that look, whether or not we like him, whether or not we like his business, he's employing millions or thousands of Nigerians. He's helping us, or he will help us to conserve foreign exchange. In fact, export more. Recently, they export some products to Brazil. That's additional foreign exchange that comes in. So in the longer term, I think that's where policies need to shift towards that. How do you then protect the interest of local manufacturers and ensure that, they can grow and thrive. So all of the things of, power supply, infrastructure, skills training, all of those things has to be in place for them to succeed. Access to intermediate input, has to be in place. Otherwise, in the next 10 years, Nigeria will still be exporting crude and then importing petrol or refined products, from other countries. And we've done that for the last 50 years. And we've seen that it's not worked. Not just Nigeria, even all of the African countries, right? And it's so bad that even when you look at the crude itself, the export of the raw material, right? I mean, somebody could argue that it's the same commodity that a country like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the likes, they export these commodities and then they still make money from it. But when you look at the volume and scale over the last 50 years, it's just like we've not even gotten as much as we should from this product. In I think in the 60s or so, we were getting something about $11 billion, from the sale of crude. Fast forward to the year 2000, it increased to about 110, $111 billion, right? 60s to 2000. But when you look at East Asia, in terms of their exports, they were getting about 30 billion, same 60s. In the 2000s, it rose from 30 billion to $2 trillion.
Wow.
So you can imagine moving from 11 billion to 110 billion dollars, and another country moving from 30 to 2 trillion by, producing diverse products and exporting this. And so there's no way that a country like Nigeria or Ghana or the likes will not be vulnerable to crude oil prices or prices of gold and cocoa when they drop, because that's what you are focused on. And you're not even doing it well. You're not even producing the crude well like the Saudis and the Qatars. Look at in 2022 when the war broke out, crude oil price went up significantly across the world, right? If you're an oil exporting country, that's the time you should benefit from it. Nigeria's crude oil production was dropping to almost a million barrels per day, right? Some of it we heard were being stolen by, other people and co. And you then wonder if this is even an asset, how come you can't protect it? You can't monitor it. You can't check how much really are you making from it. So it's almost like you're doing a bad thing and you're not even doing it well.
So what do you make of Nigeria? Because as an outsider looking at Nigeria, I hear about they have all this potential. You hear they have all these young people, growing population. They have all these resources. But then we also hear about all these problems that we talk about and just, problems with leadership and what's looking like a lot of inefficiency. So what do you make of the state of Nigeria right now? And is there hope for change?
Yeah, so I think what gives me hope, right? Mostly are the sectors that are being run by young people, and mostly those sectors that are not so much influenced by government policy, directly by government policy. In fact, some of those sectors have done tremendously well. I'm talking about sectors like the Nollywood, the music industry. In fact, I don't know if you should know Nigerian music, like how, it dominated, the world, made so much progress in that area. The movies, music industry, even in terms of skills, young Nigerians, traveling abroad, doing skilled work, working in, tech, building, training themselves, investing in themselves, just so they won't be left behind. And when you look at that kind of progress that we've made within a short time, right? It just tells you that, look, there's still hope, right? In the Nigerian himself. Like Nigerians will work hard to make things work for themselves, right? Regardless of all of the situation. I say this that sometimes living in London, like when you watch the news or you speak to people, and then the kind of things people complain about, you're wondering, they didn't come to pack my rubbish, and then everybody's like, God.
I always say this.
Yeah.
The disparity between what people here complain about
Yeah.
compared to the issues in Nigeria.
Yeah.
Because even during 2022, I'm not saying the inflation here wasn't bad, and it was bad, and people had a right to complain, but you just compare it to what goes on in
Yeah.
Nigeria, and it's like night and day.
Yeah.
Like, people complain about, what was it? What was the peak inflation? I can't remember the figures.
It got to 34%.
Yeah.
And then here inflation is just 2.8% now, and then everybody's like,
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, although again, you can argue that economics too has to deal with what happens within your environment as well.
It's all
Like
relative.
how very, very relative. How did you grow up? I remember just a few days ago, I was speaking to my neighbor, and he said he used to buy chicken and chips at for just £1 some years ago, or £2 thereabout. And now it's, I don't know, £4 or £5. But I think the point, I was trying to make, and which you touched on, is that Nigerians are resilient. They will always try to make things work, even in a very tough environment. And that spirit is what keeps Nigerians going, and it makes them excel when they leave Nigeria, and excel exceedingly well. So when they move to other countries, right? Yeah, if you're a Nigerian and you come second, you know how it is. Like you're ashamed to show it to your parents, because your parents think, look, I left that country, I came here to work hard, and then you come home and you're second in your class, or you got 80%,
and they'll tell you how they got 100% in everything they did,
and then they'll tell you, like, look, the person that got 99% has just one head like you, so how come you, so that instills in you that spirit of, I would say, excellence, or wanting to do things in the best possible way. And so that's not something you can wish away, for a country, no matter how bad or how, downtrodden things are in the country, inflation, unemployment, and co. Right? So you finish a job, you finish your education. The next thing you're thinking of is, how do I start a business? And then you start a business. The next thing you're thinking of is, how do I expand? So you have those kinds of, you have that kind of spirit, the Nigerian spirit that is always in. But I then would say that if things were better, or made better by the government, if we had, and I don't think Nigerians are asking for too much, good roads, electricity, and all of that. Trust me, that potential we're talking of, right? You would see Nigerians dominating almost every sectors of the economy, or African economy, global economy. I think Nigerians would do well. I'm not saying this because I'm Nigerian, but because.
But we've had conversations. Even Sir Paul Collier, he was saying that Nigerians do exceptionally well in the US, in the UK. It's just the environment in Nigeria is just not conducive to success.
Yeah.
Anything will ruin. Because if you try and set up a business in Nigeria, you are fighting a beast.
Yeah.
And
you can't deny that reality, no matter how you want to sugarcoat it, and say, let's not say this, but it's just the reality. And sometimes for us that, have lived here, and, back, and you go back in Nigeria, sometimes it's frustrating, it's painful, but at the same time, you just keep trying and keep advocating, engaging at different levels, just to see that hopefully things will work, at least in my generation, just to see, because some progress has been made. The other day I was at, Stratford, and then we walked into the Burna Boy show at the London Stadium in West Ham, right? I think that's a 60,000 capacity stadium, and it was filled to the brim. And I saw people of all races going in there to watch Burna Boy. I've said this many times in different platforms. That was one of the first days, like one of the few days that I was so proud being a Nigerian, because I was like one Nigerian man commanding this crowd, and people are paying to hear him sing. And so they've moved from places like the O2 to now covering stadiums, and then the crowd is there. So just imagine if these people can have the right enabling environment, right? I mean, the potential would be huge. The impact would be huge across the world.
Because even for me, being born and raised in London, growing up in London, no one cared about being Nigerian. I mean, no one was interested. No one cared about the culture. But now, and I say this to my younger brother, I said, you're so lucky. When I grew up, it wasn't like
that.
No one wanted to eat jollof rice. No one cared about Burna Boy. So even for me now, seeing everyone like listening to WizKid, it's just like I'm a bit like just shocked, because growing up, it's like, these are just local Nigerian artists. My cousins would just love to listen to them. But now it's a shared experience. Our culture is shared. I went to Portugal. This Brazilian lady who doesn't speak a word of English. And she was when I told her I was of Nigerian origin, she was so enthused by it. And she was showing me all her favorite Nigerian songs, showing me her playlist. So I do feel like there's something brewing, because culturally we're coming, I feel like there's a rise culturally. People are a lot more interested in Nigeria. I have random people telling me, I'd love to go and visit Nigeria. Like, what's it like? And perhaps this could sort of spur some sort of, I don't know. Like,
but even in Africa, like it's becoming a culture in the West, but in Africa, like the music, all the other African, people, countries look up to Nigeria, look up to, Nigerian music. It's they, being in Nigeria, you see all the problems, but all the other countries, they look up to Nigeria as this leader of such.
But Stefan, Cameroonian guy that we know. So he was saying, because Nigerians, we just complain about the problems and just, berate ourselves. But he was saying, why can't we be more like Nigeria? Why can't we do... I was thinking, I beg your pardon? Because never in my life have I heard anyone wanting to be like Nigeria. I mean, perhaps Cameroon have more issues than we do, but it was just a bit shocking to hear.
I mean, it just tells you that, look, for every country, I don't think that's peculiar to Nigeria too. Like, even here in the UK, you always, if you look at productivity numbers, it's always compared to the EU, and everybody's the UK is lagging behind other countries. And then when you're from Nigeria living in the UK, and then you're comparing, like, it's almost like two worlds apart. And then so you go elsewhere, you want to be like, so it just tells you that, look, anywhere you go to, their problems, right? Their challenges. And because you are inside that country, right, you can see more of the challenges, and you can see that things can be better. And in fact, when you then leave elsewhere, you then also see how things are done differently in those other countries, and you think, look, it can be better, right? Why shouldn't Nigerians have 24 hours electricity supply, for instance? Why does it have to be? Why should there be power cuts?
So from your time here, what have you learned that Nigeria needs to sort of copy or emulate? Or what would you take back home?
Living here, living in London, I think the organization, and particularly the role of the local councils, I think it's something that perhaps our local governments can be way, way, way better. They can be structured to function better. So I think much of the reforms should happen within the local space, in terms of how do you ensure that a local government can ensure that it does some of the basic, meet some of the basic needs in the local community. And I think that's one big area that Nigeria is lacking. And in fact, it goes to even talking about how independent are these local government officials, because most of the times they're influenced by the state. And, in the state, you have this big office where you have a state could have sometimes 40, 30 local government quite difficult or not easy to manage. Problems like waste and all of that. But if some of those responsibilities are given to the local government, and not just financial autonomy, but also in terms of discharging their work and people holding them accountable to it, I think a lot more things will be better. In terms of taxes too, I think a bit organized. You don't really have much problems of multiple taxes, even though the rates are quite high here. But at least you know what the taxes that you are meant to pay. Unlike when you start a business in Nigeria, sometimes you're responsible to the local government, non-state actors, state government, so many different levies here and there. And then as a business owner, you're just wondering all of these multiple taxes, affect you. But here, I think it's a bit more organized. But yeah, I love the Nigerian weather, to be honest. The weather is, I think, because I struggled a lot.
It must have been a shock to the system.
Yeah, it was really shocking shocking when I came in.
Because they say it's bad, but until you come.
And then you thought your jacket you were bringing from Nigeria would help you, and then you get hit by that first wind, and then you feel like this is different, and you get used to adjusting. So many culture shocks that you're just wondering what's going on. You don't really know your neighbor, and then you're wondering how do people live like this? Like everybody in their space, right? Before I got to know just one of my neighbor, it took months, and then he's the only one I know, right? But in Nigeria, as you're coming home, right? In fact, from your street, the security is already like, hey, Mr. Man, welcome. And then you walk into your apartment, and then people are coming to visit. Hey, what did you bring? You have that sense of community. But here, I'm sorry, you're just in your house. So those are some of the culture shock you will have to deal with. Especially when just moving in. And then, maybe the education system as well, different across institutions, I should say. But there's some access to resources, right, that you'd have. And I think that's also one important area that I think reforms can be made, reforming institutions and universities within Nigeria to have, easy access to global research papers and all that, because again, I do lots of research, and that's core to me, to my field. So access to journals, that you necessarily would not have access to, and I think that's something pretty important. But there's so many things that
I wanted to ask, because you were talking about the China Africa, conferences and all these leaders going to, gathering, going to China. A lot of people, they, criticize the West, for a long time, the IMF loans and these things and that. And now there's a change where China is doing a lot of work with Africa. What do you make of the new China-Africa relations, and also in this aspect of, talking about how African countries are now starting to look inwards and say, how can we make something happen? Is this a good thing? And what do you make of that relationship?
Yeah, so in the past, it used to be like the West was coming to Africa. Now it's the East, China and the likes coming to Africa. And it's not just even about policies this time, or influencing policies, or I mean, it goes beyond that to even things like infrastructure, right? Building roads, rails. Many times, working on the streets of Nigeria, you would see the Chinese construction company. You see their construction works all over different places.
When
of-
you
of
see
the
them,
country.
is it the Chinese companies? Do they have Chinese workers, or are you seeing Nigerians
Yeah,
also?
so mostly Chinese workers, and I think those are issues that still needs to be discussed, not just in Nigeria, but even in other African countries. That how do you ensure that there's some sort of skills transfer? It doesn't look like you're just bringing your workers to do projects. Of course, there are cases where Nigerians would also be employed in some of these projects, but I think that's where government policies then come in. Like, how do you ensure that before you sign some of these contracts, whether it's loan contract, infrastructure project, and all of that, there has to be some skills transfer, local content, how much of local resources do you get to use in implementing those projects. So I think that's where it'll make sense for policies to intervene. But I see, I could give examples of some of the projects, right? So in Lagos State, where I live in Nigeria, you would see that they've just completed one of the rail lines, right? And it was, supported by the Chinese, built by the Chinese, and supported by the Chinese. So you could see that, right? So when we talk about the West versus Africa and the East versus Africa, I think I prefer a model where development is physical, where you could see impact of projects, right? So driving through, you could point to that project, the rail, you would see the trains moving, and then you could say this was a product of partnerships. Of course, loans were involved, but this was a product of partnership between Nigeria and China, or a Chinese company. It's evident, right? People use it every day and see that. So I think that's where it has to go. We need to move away from this idea of extractive nature, which has always been the case, from the 60s and 70s, where it's almost about your raw materials and what you have, and we just want to exploit that, but it needs to move in forms of towards things like infrastructure, projects, power supply, investment in even education, healthcare, and all of that. And I think that's part of where it's moving toward. Hopefully it'll get better, and there will be lots of technology transfer that could happen, skills transfer as well, employing local labor, so that we would not even need the Chinese to do similar projects in other states, for instance. It's something that Nigerians can own from start to finish. I'm not saying they can't do that already, but we need to do that in a much more larger scale, just so development can be felt by the people. Yeah, so I think over time, if you look at the West, the relation, not just the West, even some of the institutions, right? They operate on ideologies. In some cases, some of these things do not really reflect or do not really understand the local problems, right? So you could have a group leaning towards trade liberalization, open your borders, free trade, not necessarily looking at the cost, to the local economy. And in fact, if I take you back to the 80s, right, and 70s and 80s, what you'd find is that whilst people would argue that, whether it's import substitution versus export-oriented industrialization, you would see that in the 70s, many African countries were focused a lot more on import substitution, right? They were looking inwards. Imagine many of the countries that got independent. So there was this national movement. In fact, there were indigenization policy, states, government owned projects, were delivering projects and all of that. But where Africa got different, where the trajectory was different between Africa and East Asia, was that it got to a point where some of these countries started looking outwards, right? And they saw that, look, I think we've protected enough. We've done import substitution enough. Why don't we test our minds and look elsewhere? And in fact, with the HCI in Korea, the heavy chemical industries, they started investing in steel and all of those things, exporting shipbuilding, exporting to other countries. And at the same time, they also did some import substitution policies as well. But what I'm just trying to get at is they protected their industries well enough to the point that they thought we can now withstand competition and we can export to the rest of the world, right? But for Africa, I think that's where we stopped. So after that import substitution policy, there was not enough effort to transition towards the export-oriented industrialization. I think that's part of the problem. And then coupled with the impact of the structural adjustment programs, which leads to the point you just talked about, the role of Western institutions or international development institutions, that when the structural adjustment programs were introduced across many African countries, the fact was that many of these countries were not ready to liberalize their exports. They hadn't built that capacity strong enough, like the East Asians, to withstand the competition from goods coming from elsewhere. And so if you check the growth trajectory of many African countries, right, in fact, manufacturing as a share of GDP started declining after the structural adjustment programs were implemented. And so you still see some of those happening today, where policies are made based on ideologies rather than based on whether it suits the local economy. And I think that's a big problem. And that's one of the things that, some of these international development institutions do. And then it has to stop. And it has to be challenged by African governments, using evidence, building a research resource base that can counter some of these arguments that are being put forward by these institutions. Otherwise, you would just, sing to the tunes of these institutions at the detriment of your local industries. And that's what's playing out. And I can give an example of how that played out recently in Nigeria, especially with the removal of fuel subsidy and all of that. Yeah.
So how do you feel about Tinubu's removal of the fuel subsidies? Because you go on you read the Financial Times and they'll tell you, oh, this is amazing, it's working so well, liberalization, this is the path to prosperity.
Yeah, to the point I'm making.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then on the ground, it's a very different story.
It's different. It's difficult on the ground. And I remember before he came on board, in fact, 3 years before he came on board, which was he became president in 2023, May of 2023. I attended so many meetings, with some of these international institutions. Some of them invited us to be part of presentations and give feedback. And I remember in about 2 or 3 of those meetings, one of the things they were arguing for is the removal of fuel subsidy, right? It was very clear in the policy statement. And in fact, they said that if Nigeria removed subsidy, inflation would only increase by about 1 percentage point or 2 percentage points, and then inflation would drop back.
Wow.
In fact, that was the message they were preaching. And I know many times I spoke against it, and I said, look, you guys are missing out some important facts about the Nigerian economy. The people who rely on fuel for transport, right? You need to factor in the people that will be left out of these policies well enough. Not just about doing some funny models and then you say inflation will increase by just 1 percentage point, and thereafter it will go back to its normal range or trend. So when the president came on board, the first thing he did was to announce the removal of fuel subsidy. He made a popular statement that subsidy is gone. And right from that day, right, everybody started adjusting. Like you go to the filling station and then you see the price of fuel had gone up, fluctuating up, down. You just don't know what's happening. So fuel that was somewhere around 200 naira a liter now sells for something around 900 naira a liter. So you could imagine the impact on the people, right? And I thought that there were issues relating to corruption as far as subsidies were concerned, right? So the people who would, because it's fuel is subsidized, people would take advantage of that and import fuel and say they imported XYZ liters. Meanwhile, they imported less than that just so they can get money out of it, right? So part of the idea of removing subsidy was to tackle the corruption and all that, which in a way I thought maybe we could have done better in actually tracing where the money is going to rather than outright removal, right? But to the point on the role of the international institutions, right? When some of these decisions are made, it's easy for a government to point to research that has been done by these institutions and say, well, they only said inflation will go up by 1 percentage point, and use that as a justification to remove fuel subsidy. So whether or not that influenced the decision is still debatable, but in a way it does, because you can argue that there's some evidence behind your action. And guess what happened to inflation? Skyrocketed to even over 30%. Inflation that was somewhere around 18% or even less some years ago, right? Within a space of just 2 years, it's gone to over 30%. And anyways, it's been rebased now. They've changed the methodology and they said inflation is now 24% or so. But even at that, it's still high. It's not, at least it's not 1 percentage point that was earlier said by these institutions. And you see that play out across different sectors. So on how I feel, I think before you make a very sensitive decision on fuel, right, I think you should, or we should have given it even more thought because of the impact that it's going to have on majority of citizens. And as we all know, inflation is the worst enemy of the poor, and not just the poor, even the middle income earners, right? So before that, in 2022, about 133 million Nigerians lived were multidimensionally poor, right? And then so with an impact of subsidy removal, and we've not invested in social security as much as we should in terms of the number of households that it covers. The refineries, were not operational. Even the Dangote refinery was not operational then. So many things that should have been in place were not given intense consideration before that significant action was made, knowing fully well that subsidy is a very contested issue. So I thought perhaps if we had done that, put some of these things in place. In fact, what we argued, we wrote a report and we had argued at the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, and we had argued for a phased removal of subsidy, that you can mitigate the impact as you go along and decide how to approach it in the best possible way. That's what we advocated for. But the outright removal, it's a tough one for people to take in, and it's really, if we were to constitute poverty survey now, in fact, I think a lot more Nigerians would have fallen into poverty. But the government is also, I think, trying to alleviate the situation. But to be honest, the scale of the problem is huge.
Yeah, because it doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't they sort of advocate for a more of a gradual reduction of subsidies? Like, why did they want to just immediately remove it?
I thought, in fact, I heard, I'm not sure if this, but I heard that it was not in the president's speech on the day because he was announced on the day he was inaugurated. And I heard his speech had been prepared, and then he was speaking, and then he just left the speech and said subsidy is gone. So that statement was what changed. And when you say things like that, you can't go back to say I meant. In fact, when that statement was made, some petrol stations had to shut down.
Wow.
Because the fuel they knew that this is an opportunity for them to raise prices. And the next day or two, prices went up.
But it's interesting that you said that part of the subsidy was to tackle the corruption in that sector. What do you think would happen if Elon Musk brought Doge to Nigeria?
Well, will he even survive? Will Doge even survive? I don't know. I don't think Nigeria is not the US, right? Even with the subsidy, right? And is what the conversation we had earlier. Dangote Refinery is there to produce fuel for the Nigerian market, and he's still struggling with the guys importing fuel because they don't want his project to, or I don't know if I'm saying this right, but he's facing resistance from a lot of people. So then imagine Doge.
Wouldn't last. Wouldn't
To
last
be
a
honest,
day.
I think we need it, right?
Mm.
Because again, it's a very important point, because part of the idea of subsidy removal was to say, look, why are we paying billions of dollars to just a group of people who claim they are importing fuel and they don't import anything at the end of the day, or they inflate the figures just so they can make some money out of it? Why is the country subject to these people? Why can't we just allow anybody import and import fuel? And the idea is to free up funds. So instead of paying these people, let's free up the funds. That fund goes into the budget or stays in the budget, and it's then used for developmental purpose. Now, I think that's the part where a lot of reform still needs to be done in that aspect of development. How do you ensure that people can reap the benefits of subsidy removal, such that the money and the gain you've made from subsidy can go into developmental projects? And I think that's where Doge then becomes, the conversation of Doge then becomes important as to what's happening with government finances. All of a sudden, after the subsidy removal, monies that were shared to the state government initially used to be around 700 billion, a trillion naira. In fact, it went up to almost 2 trillion. So it doubled, because the country now had enough money, or even more money, to share across the 36 states, and the federal government budget increased as well. But the question then is, and we're still asking those questions today, is how do you ensure efficiency of government finances? To be sure that you can hold people accountable. If the government says we spent XYZ on this road, we want to be sure that that's what they spent on that road. And we want to be sure that the money goes into capital projects, not into funding overseas trip or reckless spending. And I think that's where, that's perhaps what Elon Musk is trying to do with Doge. And maybe, hopefully, Nigerian version will come soon, but
I wouldn't put my money on it.
Yeah, but it has to come from the president.
Yeah.
It has to come. I mean, like with the US, it came from the president himself, and there's even been some backlash, right? Some agencies are, not trying to cooperate and all. But I just think it's something that I had advocated for from day one. That's where we should have started from, before even talking about removing subsidies. Reorganize government expenditures to areas that need them the most, whether it's social transfer, infrastructure, and many of those other issues. So yeah, very valid thing to do, but I don't know how it will work in the context of Nigeria.
But what do you make of Tinubu? Because he has a bit of a shady past, and
Shady.
yeah. Well, I've read that he got into this drug scandal in the US, and when they asked him about it, he said, "It wasn't me; it was my bank account, or something ridiculous." Or
I don't know. I
Oh,
have no
okay.
idea. For that, to be honest, I haven't because
Followed-
I'm more of the economic policies.
Yeah, you don't follow all the.
Yes, I know there's a lot of talks about all of those things, but I'm more of how are you going to use your position to influence or to drive development in Nigeria? What's the government priorities in terms of government development spending? How are you channeling resources? How are you ensuring that people can hold you accountable to how you use resources? So I've read all of those things, but again, I
Try to ignore it.
try to not. I mean, I'm an economist. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Wilson, thank you so much.
Is that all?
Well, I mean, we can continue.
I thought we're still talking about my PhD.
We can always.
But that's what's good about the podcast. We talk. We don't know
When it's going to.
but we see the time go by too.
Oh wow! So it's even
What
8:30.
time is
We've
it?
done 1
Yeah.
hour 30 minutes.
Yeah,
Oh, seriously?
I didn't know. Wow.
it felt short.
Yeah, I thought it was.
It felt like half an hour.
I even forgot. Were you recording?
Yeah. The whole whole time we're recording. Was it a good experience?
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't checked my phone. Like I thought, but maybe it's just 30 minutes into the conversation. To be honest,
That's perfect. That's how we like to do it. The style is just
wow.
we
No,
talk,
very
we forget the
interesting.
cameras are there, and
Yeah, it's
go
good.
with the
It's
flow.
good. Okay.
but yeah, thank you so much.
Have I contributed anything at all?
Yeah,
Yeah,
so much.
That was amazing.
Yeah.
Oh wow. So where is? Oh, okay. Oh, that's what you were doing when we were talking. That's what you were setting.
Yeah. I was setting it up.
Okay. I see. All
I,
right.
I was gonna say, all right, we're starting now, but we were already in the flow.
yeah,
of
we
You
just-
can
things.
actually introduce.
Yeah. Like I wanted to say, all right, like we're getting started, but I was just like, we're already in the flow
Yeah,
of it.
no, it's
So.
fine. It's okay.
But yeah, thank you so much, Wilson.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I note some points to
Yeah, is there anything you want to say?
Oh, okay. So I didn't talk about my PhD work at all.
I mean, we can though.
What?
Yeah,
So-
but how long is it? It should be an hour 30 minutes.
No, we have no limits.
No limits.
So, because you talked about that you mentioned briefly, you're looking at structural.
Structural transformation.
Like, could you tell us more?
Yeah. So, let me just briefly talk about it because I think it's also, important with on the conversation on industrialization, and in fact, to the question on jobs, where will the better jobs come from, within the Nigerian context, right? What you find, when you look at data is that a lot of Nigerians, are engaged in jobs that are not so productive, in terms of people are still working in subsistence farming, people still work in, non-tradable services. They do things like, petty trading, retail trading, and all of that. And so what you find, what when you look at the data, it shows that about 81% of the Nigerian workers, are in jobs that are very less productive.
81%.
Yes, 81%. And looking at that number, I think for me it was really troubling to say that how then can you even create better jobs? Jobs of the future. We're talking about AI, the role of technology, and all of that. But it then means that look, if we must grow and develop and raise, per capita income significantly, there has to be some reallocation of labor from these areas or activities of low productivity to those with high, to those with much higher productivity. And I think that's, a very big part of answering the question as to how can Nigeria develop. So there has to be some effort towards investing in manufacturing, investing in sectors like tradable services, because those sectors, they don't really employ as much people at the moment. It's just single digits share of total employment, but they have the potential to do so. I mean, you can see sectors like, agro processing. Nigeria, as you know, is endowed with a lot of agricultural products. How do you process these products? Whether it's light manufacturing, whether it's skills for ICT and technology, the creative industry. I think these are areas that, Nigerian government can even focus more on to unlock opportunities and create better jobs for people. But sadly, imagine manufacturing accounting for just 2% of the country's export earnings. In fact, last year it was 3%. The year before it was 2%. So it tells you that even when you look at what we export, like we said earlier, it's still based on crude oil, but there's very much a larger role for manufacturing to increase from 3% all the way to 10%, 20%, and the likes. And that's one of the ways that I think Nigeria can build resilience over time. So you're not subject to price fluctuations from relying on crude oil. So that's just it in summary.
How, given Nigeria's infrastructure issues, how can government navigate this transition to better jobs? Because it seems like that would be a barrier.
Yeah, so I think much of the challenge, one central problem, and infrastructure is not just even a problem for manufacturing; it's a problem for every sector. So those are like cross-cutting issues that has to be dealt with. There are ways the government is trying to set up these special economic zones where you could get firms to come in, and then infrastructure is provided within those zones. More recently, we're also seeing agro-processing zones in some states where you carve out an area and then you provide all the necessary infrastructure just so the firms can operate, in a very conducive environment. But again, it's still not enough, and this goes back to the question of what government spends money on, which we talked about earlier. So we need to allocate more of the funding to infrastructure. So it goes back to the budgeting and seeing how do we create better links between macroeconomic management and industrial policy or industrialization agenda. And I think that's one key thing the government can look into.
We were talking to economist Yasheng Huang, who was talking about development in China, and he said that China, because a lot of people look at Chinese infrastructure, and he was making a point that China developed first through focusing on these manufacturing and exports, and then built infrastructure, not the other way around.
Yeah.
Do you think that could apply to Nigeria, or does Nigeria need to build that infrastructure that they really lack first in order to be able to do this manufacturing?
I think it has to go both ways. I don't think because the question now is about causality. What influences what?
Right.
And I think it's both bi-directional. It goes both ways, because you don't have better infrastructure, you can't even export. Right. You need the ports, not just even the ports in Lagos. You need to develop ports in other regions beyond Lagos, right? You need to move rails. You invest in rails to move goods from one point to another, the roads, all of those. So I don't think we have to wait. Otherwise, the focus would then be relying on crude oil to see how you can export and get revenue from crude oil to invest in infrastructure to build to then develop manufacturing. But I think we've tried that over time since the 90s, and it's just not work. So I think both of them has to go hand in hand, where you're looking at targeted infrastructure that can enable exports, right? And interestingly, we have the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which is something that we've all been hopeful about, but very slow in terms of kickoff. But at least it started. Countries are trading under the agreement, and I think that's also something that presents a very good opportunity for Nigeria to leverage in. In fact, you look at Africa. Africa trades more with countries outside Africa. So African countries trade more with countries outside Africa than with African countries. Even Nigeria, much of our export still goes to countries outside the continent. And I'm talking here about 89% of what we export goes to countries outside the continent, right? So there is that potential for us to even trade more within Africa. And I think that can unlock huge opportunities. There's no point, importing manufactured goods from outside the continent and then exporting just crude oil, and gold and cocoa and primary products. I think Africa can do more than that and try to trade more manufactured goods within itself. Yes, it's not a large market compared to other regions, $3.4 trillion GDP, but it's something. It's a good way to start to build that capacity and capability over time before you then, as we can then also move on to export. So, yeah, I think infrastructure is important. We may not have the luxury to follow the China model, so we just have to start with what we have, yeah.
And do you think AI could have a role in sort of quickening structural transformation within Nigeria?
Yeah, very interesting question. And it was an interesting part of my PhD work, because I was a bit concerned as to how some people would say manufacturing now looks like services. And then, so it's almost like this servicification of manufacturing, that in a factory, for instance, you don't need too many workers anymore. Manufacturing is not the way it used to be, back in hundreds of years ago. Now, the machines can do all the work. And then, so the features that make manufacturing unique, you can then see them in services, and then it means manufacturing is no longer relevant. But I still don't buy those arguments. There's so many evidence that prove that, look, economies of scale, backward and forward linkages are still very important in manufacturing. And the impact of AI differs across countries, right? So when I was, working on my thesis, I had to travel, go to Nigeria, speak to, manufacturers in the local environment. And in fact, many of them were like machines, jobs, really, that we're looking for workers here. We can't even get the right people with the right skills. And so it feels like all of this AI talk is highly exaggerated, especially in the developed world, right? It's easy for you to walk, go outside, walk, and then you see someone charging their cars on the street. But how many African countries have that? I'm not saying we will not get there over time. We will, but I think sometimes it just feels like the world is, everybody's AI, but there are people who it's not as rapid as it's been portrayed in the media in some parts of the world, right? It will impact because, again, whether you adopt technology or not, right, you will still import mass produced goods from countries that use technology, which then goes to how trade policies are then implemented. But the point I'm making is everybody uses, most firms use technology, machines and co, but how much of it is digital? How much of it is advanced? The big firms, it's easy for them to buy and and the very large equipment, advanced technology, and use that to produce. It's very easy for them, but and unfortunately or fortunately, most of the manufacturing firms are small scale in Nigeria and many other African countries. So it's not going to be easy for them to use AI. Where's the capital, the training, the skills? So people will still have to make use of what exists in their country. And that's what people are doing, the people that I spoke to. And it's not like they are not aware that changes are happening elsewhere, but you still need somebody to, for instance, to use some basic machines to do some basic manufacturing work. You still need skilled labor. So in a way, I think ultimately there will have to be like that balance between the role of AI and labor. And even we see that here too in some countries. So one of the examples that one of the manufacturers gave was that initially they were using buckets to fetch water, for their plant, and all. And at some point, what they did was to, implement and, they put in some pumps, to bring in the water. It still didn't mean that the person that was fetching water was sacked, right? The person was still employed. In fact, the roles shifted to managing the pumps and doing other things. So there's some technology that will convert jobs from one form to another. Not necessarily that the jobs will ultimately disappear or the person will lose their jobs. So those are the kinds of technologies you see. They are not advanced per se, but they're still technologies that enhance productivity and improve processes within manufacturing. So you will still see that happening across board, perhaps in the next 10 years. I don't think these companies will all adopt AI and become,
Yeah. It's a good point to say that the advancement of AI has been overstated by kind of the media. It has been overhyped because I was just talking to Dara, I think earlier today, and we were thinking back, it was almost 2 years now where ChatGPT came onto the scene, and we were all thinking, wow, in 2 years, 5 years, it's going to be, AI is just going to take over everything. And we've just seen slower increments of advancements in the AI, and we've gotten used to it, and
Yeah.
nothing much has changed. And it's an important point because I remember back when it came onto the scene, people were filled with this pessimism where it completely killed their motivation, asking questions like, what's the point? We're all going to be replaced. And it just kills people's drives. And I think it's important to remember that, no, people are still important.
Yeah.
And maybe one day in the future, we won't need to work.
Yeah.
But right now, there are issues that need to be tackled. And
Yeah.
we shouldn't let AI stop that.
I know you can't really say, but how far away do you think that actually is?
How far that time?
Yeah,
When-
where labor is just not needed in some of these very like low value or just manufacturing in general, actually.
I think thinking from an African perspective, right? That time, I don't know, maybe 20 years, 15 years. I don't think it's now. From what I see on the ground, like people still need workers.
Yeah.
People are looking for workers with the right skill to stay and do the job. The gaps are there. The market is there, right? They can't import these technologies because they are so expensive, right? So people don't even have access to internet. There's some places the cost of internet is really high. And we must recognize that people like that exist. Like the world is not just about, what's happening in London, in New York, and all of these major cities, right? That there are people who still live in, communal settings and they're fine with it and they're moving on with their lives, right? I'm optimistic about AI, but I think we also need to be realistic as to what can happen. I use ChatGPT, I use all of this, but at the same time, not everybody uses them. Not everybody sees the value or understands them in a way, right? So I think that's where I'm trying to balance that. Look, innovation is good, but it's not even across the world. The countries that certainly are not at that pace for whatever reason, even issues relating to patent. In fact, with ChatGPT, it just shows that, look, this AI thing can even be copied easily with DeepSeek, right? You can see someone can sit and copy this thing and then it just looks like so and so what? How many of these, we now have many of these similar tools, elsewhere, so to be honest, and even the more you use ChatGPT, and then I then wonder, is this thing really smart with with some of the errors? And then you keep asking, why did you make the mistake? And it tells you, oh, I'm sorry. And then so I'm not saying technology advancement is not important or is not a good thing, right? But I'm just saying that, look, maybe we're even at a point where there's this diminishing return that you just get so used to it and you're looking at the next new thing and it's not big and massive enough. By now, I remember during the pandemic, I was very optimistic thinking that, those machines that clean the rooms and then you just buy them and they'll do all your laundry and they keep moving around and then you talk. But maybe it's just me, I don't know, but I'm not seeing much of those things happening, around, right? So you just get used to it and it just stays like that for a while. But I think there's potential, especially as we get more people have access to mobile phones, digital technology, access to internet, financial inclusion, and all of those things. The more people get on board, then perhaps the more skill that technology will have, in terms of reaching people, making us more productive, enabling access. And I think that's one beautiful thing about technology, enabling access. And I remember the hailing apps, the boats, Uber, and how they made life a lot, changed this landscape of, transportation in a city like Lagos, where, the taxis used to be old, rickety, and overpriced. And then you have to go look for them. But now with your app, it's easy for you to make an order and then it comes right to you. And I think that's the beauty of technology, enabling access, and perhaps at a much cheaper rate. So yeah, I'm I'm optimistic, but at the same time, I'm realistic, especially as it relates to manufacturing. In fact, there's a study by UNIDO that showed that only 12% of manufacturing firms have adopted advanced technology in Africa. 12% is really low. And we're talking of the firms that are the top, that have good finances, good structure, access to resources, and just 12%. So you can imagine that a lot of manual production still happens, even within cities. And then when you move outside major cities to rural areas, right, you still see this one-man business-led manufacturing outfit. They still happen. So what I am advocating is that we need to support these firms. It doesn't have to be that heavy transition to using AI and co. It could just be like investing in that pump. That's what they need to raise productivity at that level. When they get used to it over time, they would, be able to look for much better technology to use, right? So it has to be a gradual process. Otherwise, you would lose people, when you transition. Yeah.
And now you're finishing up your PhD and going back to Nigeria. What are your plans?
Well, the plans are endless. The opportunities are endless. So I'm looking at different options. I'm still, with the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, where I do research, and see how some of these findings that I've had, can be translated into policy and then implemented by the government. And by the fact that, I've been engaged in policy advocacy in Nigeria, engaging with policymakers through different platforms. So perhaps it's an opportunity for me to leverage on the institutions and even other platforms that I have to push for better policies to advance industrialization. Industrialization is not just manufacturing now, it's also in tradable services, investing in skills development, across the country. And so that's my goal. And then also still hang around in London when I want to be part of conversations like this, because sometimes, there are also conversations that happen here that sometimes you need voices from Africa to influence and shape these policies, and even let people understand what's really happening on the continent, that sometimes it's not just about what you read on the internet, but people's lives are there. And, how do you then make decisions here that will affect them, and ensure that those decisions are better planned, for the situation on ground. So, yes, in Nigeria, but at the same time, keep the doors open here. You never know.
Stay connected.
Yeah, stay connected. That's it.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for bringing that African and Nigerian perspective. It was very good. I really enjoyed it.
It was an absolute pleasure. So thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. It was a good conversation. I didn't even know we've done almost 2 hours.
That's the best way we do it.
Yeah.
All right, cool. That's it.